The text came through at 11,047 on a Tuesday night, when the rain was hitting my windows so hard it sounded like gravel. I almost missed it. My phone was face down on the coffee table and I was half asleep on the couch. Still in my work clothes, a cold cup of coffee on the floor beside me. But something made me reach for it. The message was from my nephew Owen. He was 7 years old. "Uncle Ray, please come. Aunt Carol said you can't, but please. I'm so hungry, and I don't know where Danny is, and it's dark, and I don't want to cry anymore." I was on my feet before I finished reading it. My hands were already shaking when I grabbed my keys off the hook by the door. I didn't change. I didn't think. I just moved the way your body moves when something ancient and protective takes over and your brain hasn't caught up yet. Owen wasn't supposed to have a phone. He wasn't supposed to be texting anyone at midnight. And he wasn't supposed to be hungry, alone, and scared in a house that was supposed to be keeping him safe. That house belonged to my brother Marcus's wife's family, and nothing about that sentence had ever felt right to me. Let me back up, because you need to understand how we got here. My brother Marcus was 32 when he died, a blood clot, completely without warning on a Wednesday morning in March while he was making coffee. His wife, Diane, had passed 8 months before him from ovarian cancer. They had 2 kids, Owen, who was 6 at the time, and Danny, who was 9. By the time Marcus died, those boys had already lost their mother. And then, in less than a year, they lost their father too. I was 29, I had a 2-bedroom apartment, a steady job in logistics, and no experience raising children. But I was there. I showed up to the hospital, I showed up to the funeral. I told those boys I loved them and I meant it with everything I had. What I didn't have was a lawyer. Diane's parents, Gerald and Ruth Kavanaugh, did. Within 6 weeks of Marcus's death, Gerald and Ruth had filed for emergency guardianship of Owen and Danny. Their argument was that I was too young, financially unstable, living in a small apartment with no experience in childcare. Their lawyer made me sound like a risk. My own grief made me slow. And the judge, looking at a retired couple in their 60s with a 4-bedroom house and a history of raising children versus a 29-year-old single man still figuring out how to function, she ruled in their favor. Temporary guardianship. Pending review in 12 months. I told myself it would be okay. I told myself Gerald and Ruth loved those boys. Diane had spoken well of them. I had no reason then to think otherwise. I visited when I could. Every 2 or 3 weeks, I'd drive the 40 minutes to their house in Cloverfield, bring the boys whatever they asked for. Books, Legos, the occasional video game Danny had been eyeing. Gerald was always polite. Ruth made tea. The boys seemed okay. But Owen was always watching me when I came in. Not with excitement, the way a kid watches someone they're happy to see. With something else, something careful. Like he was calculating how much time he had before I left again. I noticed it, but I told myself I was projecting. I told myself kids process grief in strange ways. I told myself I wasn't qualified to read the situation. I should have listened to that feeling. The night Owen texted me, I drove 40 minutes in a rainstorm and I didn't call ahead. That was deliberate. The few times I'd shown up unannounced before, Ruth had seemed flustered in a way that bothered me, but that I hadn't been able to name. This time I didn't want to give anyone time to rearrange anything. I pulled up to the house at 12:23 in the morning. Every light on the ground floor was on. I knocked. No answer. I knocked harder. Still nothing. I tried the doorbell, twice. I stood there in the rain for what felt like a full minute and then I called Owen's number back. He picked up on the first ring. "Uncle Ray." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Owen, buddy. I'm outside. Right outside the front door. Can you come let me in?" A pause. "I can't leave my room. Ruth said if I leave my room at night, she takes Danny's game controller away." Something cold moved through my chest. "Okay, where's Ruth right now? I don't know." "The TV is on downstairs. Is Danny with you?" Another pause, longer this time. "Danny went somewhere with Gerald 2 days ago. Ruth said he's at a camp thing, but he didn't bring his backpack." I hung up and I knocked on that door like my knuckles were going to break. Ruth answered on the 3rd round of knocking. She was in a bathrobe and her hair was down and she did not look surprised to see me. She looked irritated, which is its own kind of telling. "Raymond, it's after midnight. I know what time it is. Where's Owen? In his room, asleep, where a child is supposed to be at this hour. He texted me 40 minutes ago. He said he was hungry. Something across her face that she shut down too quickly. Children say things. He had dinner. He's fine. I want to see him. You can see him Sunday. You know the visitation schedule, Ruth. I said her name quietly, the way you say something when you're making a decision about how far you're willing to go. I'm not leaving this porch until I see Owen. You can open the door and let me come in, or I can call 911 right now and let them decide who gets to see him first. She opened the door. Owen was not asleep. He was sitting on the floor of his room with his back against the bed frame, still fully dressed in the clothes he'd clearly been wearing all day, a half-eaten sleeve of crackers in his lap. He looked up when I came in and his face did something complicated, relief and something like embarrassment, like he wasn't sure he'd done the right thing by texting me. I sat down on the floor next to him without saying anything for a moment. Hey buddy, hey, you okay? He picks at the edge of a cracker. I didn't have dinner. I said I wasn't hungry and then I was, but it was late and I didn't want to go downstairs. I looked at him. There were shadows under his eyes that were too deep for a 7-year-old. His wrists, where they stuck out from his sleeves, looked thinner than I remembered. How long have you been not eating dinner? He shrugged the way kids shrug when a thing has been happening long enough that they can't remember when it started. I fed him that night. I found enough in the kitchen to make him a proper meal, which Ruth watched from the doorway with her arms crossed and her mouth pressed into a line. I didn't say anything to her while I cooked. I was doing the mental math I probably should have done months ago, adding up every visit where something hadn't seemed quite right, every comment Owen had made that I'd explained away, every time Danny had gotten quiet when I asked him how things were going. When Owen was fed and his eyes were getting heavy, I tucked him in and I went back downstairs. Where is Danny? I asked. Ruth was at the kitchen table. Gerald wasn't home, and I made a note of that. He's at a camp with Gerald, an outdoor education program. It was a good opportunity. What's the name of the camp? A beat. I'd have to look it up. Please do. Raymond, it's nearly 1 in the morning. The name of the camp, Ruth. She gave me a name. I wrote it down. I didn't know yet whether it was real. I left that night, but I drove home with a different feeling in my body than I'd ever had before. It wasn't just worry. It was the specific nausea of understanding that something has been wrong for a long time and you failed to see it. I called Owen's school the next morning. This is the part I need you to understand, because it matters. Under federal law and the laws of most states, school employees are mandated reporters. Teachers, counselors, office staff, bus drivers, all of them are required by law to report signs of abuse or neglect to Child Protective Services. It is not optional. It is not a judgment call. It is the law. Owen's second-grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Paulson, had apparently noticed that Owen was coming to school tired and unfocused, that he'd been taking extra portions at lunch for several months, that he'd mentioned once that dinner time at home was complicated. She had flagged it internally. She had mentioned it to the school counselor. The counselor had sent a note home to Gerald and Ruth asking for a meeting. Gerald had responded with a letter from a family physician, not Owen's regular pediatrician, a different doctor, stating that Owen had been evaluated and was healthy and that the school's concerns were unfounded. The counselor had accepted this. No CPS report had been filed when I found this out, and I found it out because I called the school directly and asked specific questions in the kind of flat, careful voice that communicates that you are not going to be redirected. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my office building and I stared at the steering wheel for a long time. Then I called my cousin Devin, who is an attorney. Devin is the kind of person who asks 3 questions and then tells you what you need to do. He listened to everything I told him, asked me to text him the timeline I'd written out the night before, and called me back 40 minutes later. You need to file for emergency custody, he said, and you need to do it before Gerald gets back from wherever he is with Danny. Can we do that? You have grounds. Documented hunger, a child alone at midnight, a school that flagged concerns, a guardian who provided a questionable medical letter to shut down an investigation. Yes, we can do that, but Raymond, you need to find Danny first. I found Danny because of a woman named Patricia Osei. Patricia lived 2 houses down from Gerald and Ruth, and she had been, for the last 6 years, exactly the kind of neighbor that most people take for granted. The one who watches things without being asked to, who notices patterns, who files away information out of some deep civic instinct. She'd seen me come and go over the months. She'd seen Gerald leave with Danny 3 days ago in a car she didn't recognize. She had written down the license plate because that was the kind of woman Patricia was. I knocked on her door because I was out of other ideas, because I'd been standing in Gerald and Ruth's driveway for 10 minutes, and my gut was telling me not to leave without more than I'd come with. She answered in a gardening apron and looked at me with the direct expression of someone who had already been expecting this conversation. "You're Marcus's brother," she said. "Yes. I was wondering when you'd come knock on my door." She stepped back. "Come in." Patricia told me everything she'd observed over the last several months with the calm precision of someone making a statement to a detective. The schedule changes. The way Owen looked when he came home from school versus how he looked on weekdays when Gerald and Ruth had guests. Tidier, fed, performing the version of childhood that looked correct to outside eyes. The car that had been at the house 3 times in the last 2 months that Patricia had seen a woman get out of, a woman in her 40s with short dark hair who stayed for about an hour each time and always left with a folder or an envelope of some kind. "Do you know who she is?" I asked. Patricia picked up her phone and showed me a photo. She had taken it from her front window. The image was a little blurry, but clear enough. I didn't recognize her. But I recognized the logo on the folder she was carrying. It was a financial services company, the same one that administered the estate trust Marcus had set up for Owen and Danny before he died. My brother had not been wealthy, but he had been careful. He had a life insurance policy, and after Diane died, he had worked with a financial advisor to structure a trust for the boys, money to cover their education, their basic needs through childhood, a small amount to be released to each of them at 25. Gerald and Ruth, as legal guardians, had been granted limited access to draw from that trust for documented child-related expenses. I called Devin back and told him about the woman with the folder. He went quiet for a moment. Then, "How large is the trust?" I told him. He went quiet again, longer. "Raymond, get to that school today and tell them directly verbally that you are formally requesting a CPS report be filed. Use those words, then meet me at my office at 4. I pulled Owen out of school at noon. I told the office it was a family emergency. The look on Mrs. Paulson's face when I signed the form told me she understood something was happening and she was relieved someone was finally moving. Owen asked me in the car if he was in trouble. "No," I told him. "You are the opposite of in trouble. You are the one person who did exactly the right thing." He thought about this. "Because I texted you. Because you texted me." He looked out the window. "I was scared you'd be mad. Ruth said you were too busy for us." I kept both hands on the wheel, and I breathed through my nose until I trusted myself to speak. "I am never too busy for you. Do you understand me?" "Never. Not for 1 second." He nodded. Then, quietly, "Danny said the same thing. He said you'd come if we asked." Danny was right. We found Danny through the license plate Patricia had given me. Devin had a contact at the county clerk's office who ran the plate and came back with a registration to a property in a town called Harwick, about 60 miles north. It wasn't a camp. It was a vacation rental that Gerald had booked under a different name. A shell LLC that Devin, once he started pulling the financial thread, found was connected to a series of disbursement requests from the boys' trust. The picture that assembled itself over the next 72 hours was this. Gerald and Ruth had been drawing from Owen and Danny's trust for nearly 8 months. The disbursements were itemized as child-related expenses: clothing, educational materials, medical copays, extracurricular programs. None of these expenses were real. The trust had been paying for a renovation on Gerald's brother's property in Arizona. It had been paying the lease on a new vehicle registered to Ruth's sister. It had been paying in small regular increments into a savings account that Devin's forensic accountant contact identified as belonging to Gerald personally. The woman with the folder was a financial consultant who had been helping Gerald structure the disbursement request to look legitimate. My nephew Danny had been taken to a remote rental property, not a camp, not a program, nothing, while Gerald managed what appeared to be a conversation with the trust administrator that required Owen to be out of the picture. Danny didn't know what was happening. He knew he was bored, and that Gerald kept taking phone calls outside, and that there was no Wi-Fi. We drove to Harwick. Devin had already been on the phone with a family court judge. By the time Gerald answered the door of the rental property and saw me standing there with Devin and a county sheriff's deputy, whatever he'd planned to say died somewhere between his brain and his mouth. Danny saw me from inside the house. He was sitting at a kitchen table with a sandwich in front of him, and he stood up so fast the chair scraped back across the floor. Uncle Ray. He didn't run, because Danny was 9 and 9-year-olds maintain composure, but he walked toward me with the stiff-legged urgency of someone trying not to run. I met him halfway and I put my arms around him and I held on. He said, into my shoulder, I kept telling him to call you. I know, buddy. I've got you. Gerald was removed from the property. The deputy stayed. Devin made calls. I drove both boys back to my apartment, where they sat on my couch with takeout and the television on. Owen leaning against Danny's arm, Danny scrolling through streaming options with the focused energy of someone who has been through something and is not yet ready to talk about it. I sat across from them and I watched them and I felt about 11 different things at once, none of which I had words for. The custody hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Ruth's attorney argued that the financial concerns were a separate matter, that the guardianship had been appropriate and caring, that one night of a child being hungry was not a pattern of neglect. The attorney was good. I'll give her that. But Devin was better. He entered into evidence the school's internal documentation flagging Owen's behavior and hunger over several months. He entered the disbursement records from the trust, annotated by the forensic accountant. He entered Patricia's written statement, which was specific and detailed and devastating in the way that only simple observations can be. He entered the documentation showing that Gerald had taken Danny to an unregistered, undisclosed location without notifying the court or the boy's caseworker, which was itself a violation of the guardianship terms. He also entered a statement from Owen's pediatrician, who had examined Owen at my request 2 days after I'd brought him to my apartment. Owen had lost 8 pounds in 4 months. His iron levels were low. The doctor's language in the report was careful and clinical, but there is no clinical language that makes those numbers anything other than what they are. Ruth cried on the stand. She said she loved those boys. She said she had done her best. She said the money was complicated and there were misunderstandings. The judge listened to all of it. She was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and an expression I couldn't read throughout the entire proceeding. She took a 20-minute recess before delivering her ruling. I sat in that courtroom with my hands clasped on the table and I thought about Marcus making coffee on a Wednesday morning, about Diane in her last months telling the boys she wasn't going anywhere, about Owen sitting on his bedroom floor with a sleeve of crackers in the dark. When the judge came back, she removed Gerald and Ruth's guardianship. She granted me emergency full custody of Owen and Danny, pending a formal review in 90 days, at which point the court would evaluate the stability of the placement. She referred the financial matter to the district attorney's office, noting that the disbursement records presented sufficient cause for a criminal investigation. She also issued a formal statement to the school district, noting the failure of mandated reporting protocols in Owen's case and directing that appropriate steps be taken. She did not look at Gerald and Ruth when she said most of this. She looked at the file in front of her and then at me, and then, briefly, at the 2 empty seats beside me where the boys would have been if they hadn't been in the waiting area outside with Devin's paralegal. "Mr. Carter," she said, "do you understand the responsibility you're taking on?" "Yes," I said. "I've understood it since March." She nodded once and closed her file. I walked out of that courtroom and into a waiting area where Owen was drawing something on the back of a legal pad and Danny was reading a sports magazine upside down, either by accident or because he thought it was funny. Danny saw my face first. He put the magazine down. "Well, we're going home," I said. Owen looked up from his drawing. "Your home?" "Our home. I need to get a bigger couch." Owen considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old making important evaluations. "Can we get a dog?" I laughed. It came out louder than I expected, the kind of laugh that surprises you because it's carrying more than just amusement. "Yeah, buddy, we can talk about a dog." Gerald was charged 11 weeks later. The DA's office brought charges including breach of fiduciary duty, theft by deception, and financial exploitation, the last charge carrying the most significant potential sentence. Ruth was charged as an accessory. The financial consultant who had been helping structure the disbursements was charged separately. I won't tell you I felt satisfaction when I heard. What I felt was something quieter and more exhausted than that. The kind of feeling that comes when something is finally over, but the weight of how long it went on doesn't go away just because the ending was right. Owen started third grade in September at a school 3 blocks from our apartment. His teacher called me in October to tell me he'd won something in the class writing contest, a short story about a dog that gets lost and finds its way home. She said he'd read it aloud to the class and half of them cried. She said it like a compliment, and it was. Danny made the school basketball team. He left his shoes in the middle of the floor at a frequency that would test any reasonable person's patience, and ate approximately twice his body weight in cereal every morning, and was, in every moment, exactly the person Marcus would have wanted him to be. I thought about Marcus a lot that year. I thought about what he would say if he could see the two of them. Owen drawing at the kitchen table, Danny narrating whatever game he was watching on TV with the full confident authority of a 9-year-old sports commentator. I thought about what he'd say to me. I think he'd say, "You got there. It wasn't fast enough." There are things I missed, warning signs I let myself explain away because I wasn't ready to do what catching them would have required. There is a version of this story where Owen keeps sitting in the dark on his bedroom floor and doesn't text anyone, because he's learned by then that asking doesn't work. I live with that version too. But he did text, and I came. That's the part I hold on to when the rest gets heavy. He knew to reach for me, and I was there to reach back. If you take anything from this, take that. Pay attention to the kids in your orbit. Not just whether they have food and shelter on paper, but whether they look the way kids are supposed to look. Whether their eyes are right. Whether they're watching you with that careful, calculating expression that means they're measuring how much they can trust you. Trust is something you build by showing up before it's an emergency. I'm still building it, every day.